Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. David's son Absalom, while guilty of murder, had been welcomed back to Jerusalem, but not with open arms. David had refused to meet with his long-exiled son and relegated him to a form of house arrest. 2 years would pass with David doing what he normally did in situations like this: nothing. And his son would grow in his resentment toward him. In 2 Samuel 14, verses 25 through 33, we're going to see this less than ideal situation grow increasingly toxic as David continues his pattern of inaction and Absalom reaches the tipping point. David's lousy leadership was going to come back and haunt him. He had chosen to ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and now he was going to pay for it. And David was going to discover that, while he had been willing to do nothing, Absalom wasn't. The son of the king, unimpressed with his father's leadership, would begin to have aspirations for his father's throne. David had agreed to Absalom's return to Jerusalem, but had essentially placed him under house arrest, refusing to see him. After a 3-year absence from the kingdom, Absalom found himself persona non grata, ignored by his own father, and left to wonder why he had agreed to come home at all. And he would end up waiting 2 full years because David continued to rely on his parenting style of inaction. There would be no punishment or pardon for the wrong committed. And the long delay gave Absalom plenty of time to grow in his resentment for his father. He most likely recalled David's unwillingness to take action against Amnon for raping his sister. David had done nothing, and 2 years later, Absalom would get frustrated by David's lack of decisive action, taking matters into his own hands and having his brother Amnon murdered. This had led to his 3-year exile. Now he was home, but another 2 years had passed, and he saw his father's incapacity to deal with the issue at hand. Whatever respect he had once held for his father was long gone. He viewed David as a man of weakness, plagued by indecisiveness. It would be centuries later that the Apostle Paul wrote the words, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord." Ephesians 6, verse 4. David could have used this simple yet profound advice. The Greek word Paul used is paragizo, and it's translated provoke to anger. But it can also mean to exasperate. To provoke someone to anger sounds like it refers to a deliberate attempt to purposefully annoy or deliberately rouse anger in another individual. And that most certainly can be true in many cases. But we can create anger in another human being by doing nothing. We can frustrate them by our lack of initiative or general apathy. David was provoking in Absalom an anger and resentment that was fed by his father's lack of leadership. He was slowly beginning to view David as weak and incapable of leading decisively. And because Absalom viewed his father as being incompetent to lead his own family, he would soon reach the conclusion that he was unqualified to lead the nation of Israel. We can see Absalom's growing anger and frustration and how he handled Joab's refusal to answer his request for an audience with the king. Like his boss, Joab did nothing. And finally, Absalom snapped, taking matters into his own hands and commanding his servants to set fire to Joab's barley crops. That got his attention. You can see Absalom's growing exasperation with the whole situation. He had waited 2 years and simply wanted something to be done. He even told Joab, "I wanted you to ask the king why he brought me back from Geshur if he didn't intend to see me. I might as well have stayed there. Let me see the king. If he finds me guilty of anything, then let him kill me." 2 Samuel 14, verse 32. Absalom would rather face death than having to live in limbo, confined to his home. But there is almost an underlying sense that Absalom knew David would do nothing. He seems to know that his father would never sentence him to death for his murder of Amnon. So he was willing to force David's hand, confident that his father would act true to form and do nothing, which is exactly what happened. Joab went to David and convinced him to see Absalom, which he did. And from all appearances, it seems that David pardoned Absalom, kissing his son and restoring him to his former state. Absalom got what he wanted, but he would not be satisfied. He had had plenty of time to consider his future and plan his next move. This would prove to be just the first step in his plan to take advantage of what he perceived as his father's leadership flaws. The text gives us an interesting and somewhat out-of-context description of Absalom's appearance. It describes his good looks and goes into great detail about the thickness of his hair. All of this talk about Absalom's appearance seems out of place and a bit odd, but it's designed to set up what comes next. Absalom was handsome in appearance. In fact, he was flawless from head to foot. 2 Samuel 14 verse 25. And we're going to find out that he was also clever. He was a natural-born leader who had good looks, charisma, charm, and the powers of persuasion that would make any politician envious. Now that he was out from under any threat of punishment for his murder of Amnon, Absalom was going to use his good looks and natural leadership skills to plan his future, which would include his father's downfall. It's interesting to note that Paul gives another warning to fathers in his letter to the Colossians. He writes, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children, so that they will not lose heart." Colossians 3 verse 21. David had frustrated his son. He had done nothing to bring justice to the cause of Tamar. He had left his own daughter in a state of mourning, having had her virginity taken from her by force. The law clearly stated what David should have done. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 through 29. According to the law, David should have forced Amnon to marry Tamar, and forbidden him from ever divorcing her. No longer a virgin, Tamar was left in a state where she would have been considered damaged goods by the men in her community. Her value as a potential wife had been irreparably damaged. All along the way, and because of his indecisiveness, David had left a wake of disaster and damaged lives. His inaction had left Amnon unpunished and Tamar humiliated and unwanted. His unwillingness to do the right thing had only resulted in a host of wrong outcomes. Absalom had killed Amnon and then spent 3 years in exile. Even when he was allowed to return home, Absalom found himself in a frustrating limbo, trapped by his father's unwillingness to do his job as a father and his duties as a king. And all of this was going to lead to further resentment on Absalom's part that would ultimately surface as rebellion.